Black revolutionaries, distillery owners, Italian fashion retailers, and Motown Grammy winners all share their best stories never before told in any other media outlets on Detroit is Different. Visit DetroitisDifferent.com or download the Detroit is Different app on Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store.
Welcome back to the Detroit is Different podcast studios. And today I have a guest that met this year. And definitely upon meeting, it was so many other connections that connect, but more so just the thought process about things that can empower Detroit communities just stood tall. And then from there, so much more. She was a big asset to what we did with Gig Fair earlier this year, and then finding out so much about what she does with Operations School and really her story in general. And also, like, you're seeing so much between her and her husband and the creativity connection there. This is a beautiful one. Beautiful one. And plus, you probably seen my post, and it's not just her, it's some other dynamic Black women that I think are doing a lot, just not in business, but also in community and creativity. And you know, creativity and community are the foundation of everything I'm passionate about. Hence, it goes over to Detroit. It's different. Racheal Allen, how are you today?
I'm wonderful, Kari. Thanks so much for having me.
Definitely. It's definitely taking some time to get this going. And, you know, things happen. And we definitely know it's the right time when they happen. So we're going to start this off like usual. Classic Detroit is Different story. Okay. Your story. What brought you and your family to Detroit? What's the Detroit roots?
Mm-hmm. So my mom was born in Detroit, and she actually moved to California, and that's where she met my dad. So myself and all of my siblings were born in Pasadena, California. We moved back to Detroit just before I turned, I think, 4 years old. So I started kindergarten here. One of the first places that we moved was the Sojourner Truth Home. So we lived on the Eastside in the projects, and we pretty much stayed on the Eastside for most of the time that I lived in Detroit. So I lived in just about every neighborhood on the Eastside in Detroit. 10 different schools, 12 years, product of DPSCD. And so I consider myself being from Detroit, but I always have to add that caveat of from Detroit, not necessarily born in Detroit.
That's unique. And then you just touched on something that's definitely another historic Detroit fact. So she touched on the Sojourner Truth Home. So a lot of people kind of know the story of the Brewster projects because, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt came, and it was so much more in the story. And you know, people talk about the history of the Brewsters and, you know, the way that Joe Louis's boxing gym was down there. But don't know how many people are aware, but the Sojourner Truth Homes were really one of the first iterations of what would be later known as housing projects. And this really goes more so into racial discrimination because a lot of the I guess the Black people that were coming here through the Great Migration definitely kind of leaning towards the East Side, though that's kind of out the footprint, obviously, of where the Brewsters are at. And when we think about so many Black folks being in Black Bottom, but the Sojourner Truths were closer to some other manufacturing development and industry, and just dealing with just such hardcore racism, the government and also, you know, the big three stepped in and wanted to create a space and place for Black people, hence the Sojourner Truths.
Yeah.
Now, that is the origin story of the Sojourner Truth Homes. Knowing my travels and everything, and if you've ever been there, and that's definitely one of those neighborhoods where usually you know people over there if you're over there, you know. So, you know, we think about Coney Gardens, we think about a little bit of Persian, a little bit of Osborne. That's a unique community. And you said you've been all over the East Side, and the East Side has its own culture, just like the West Side does. But the culture of the East Side, especially now today, is, I believe, some of the roots of a lot of the home ownership in the non, as they say, glamorous communities still exist strong. So I give that long leeway to just give some context so people can understand that the Sojourner Truth Homes were part of housing projects where you had families that were there for generations up through maybe like I would say maybe like the late 90s, early 2000s. So it wasn't like the average where it's like, okay, this family ages out and then they're no longer here. Like that was like their community.
Absolutely. And interestingly, we lived in what was kind of a second phase. So it was one of the newer units. So we were the first people to live in our unit back in, what had to probably be like 87. My grandfather worked for the city of Detroit. He was an exterminator. And so he was able to get us on the list to get into that unit. So as a young person going to Atkinson Elementary, we used to walk to school from there. You would not have been able to tell me that that wasn't an upper middle class suburban neighborhood, right? It was beautifully constructed. We had a big backyard and we had all of our friends who lived there. So it's folks now that I know who I grew up with that I can date all the way back to being in the Sojourner Truce. And it wasn't until my mom started making more income that her rent went up and it was time for her to look at potentially buying a house. So from there, we ended up moving to like the State Fair and Gratiot area. And we were one of the first Black families in that neighborhood. So by about 1991, I think there was one other Black family on our block at the time. And this was really the height of white flight. So I started elementary school at Trix Elementary, probably third grade by then. And I remember having multiracial friends. We could ride our bike around the neighborhood. And then it happened right around the end of third grade into fourth grade. All the white kids left. There were no more white kids in our neighborhood. And so we're talking about 48205, which is one of the most dangerous zip codes in the country now, known as the red zone, all of that. There was a time when that was a white neighborhood.
Completely.
That
was definitely like one of those like, Pizza Hut, soccer team. Like it was a cusp of like during the early 90s for us that, that have been there. Like that was an area, you're like Gratiot and State Fair Cross. And then you think about it and then it became a little bit more prevalent as we see different divestment in communities as the people occupying the community changes. And that's been a story for Black communities across America and in some ways, in certain places throughout the world for a while. So seeing that definitely had to be impactful. So let's go a little to your mom's story. What led her, first, what community did she grow up in when she was in Detroit? And then what led her out to Cali?
So my mother grew up in Jefferson Chalmers. So she lived at 669 Navajo, which is one of those blocks just almost before you get to the Detroit River. So growing up, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' home, and it was a beautiful, beautiful community. And so probably now in retrospect, it probably was a distressed community like most, but being so close to the Detroit River, it gave a sense of kind of serene that you just don't realize you're having when you're growing up. So this was a part of town that most people had never seen, south of Jefferson, for example. And so my mom, and actually let me go back and say that my grandparents bought that house, and I would probably say if my mom was born in 55, they bought that house right around that time. They, had to pay cash, $8,000 to buy that house. And so when you put that into kind of translation into kind of what that was, there weren't mortgages. You couldn't, you had to save your money and pay cash for a house because not everybody was able to, get the financing to do that at the time. So they bought the house, and then my mom moved to California, I'd probably say in her early 20s. And it really, I think, was just a way to kind of get as far away from Michigan probably as possible. I think she ended up in a couple other places before then. And then my father was from St. Louis. He happened to have migrated to Los Angeles. And then my parents were both in ministry when they met each other and then fell in love in California.
Ain't that something? Boy, St. Louis is another one of those. St. Louis is another one of those classic cities. I kind of liken it because I have so much family from Cincinnati where it's like, these are some Southern people.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you ever have a chance to go to St. Louis and everything, I think for us, in our age range, like Nelly and like him introducing like even country grammar. Like
Yeah.
country grammar. You know, you're thinking to yourself like, how southern is St. Louis? And it's like, yeah, if you go there, it's definitely a place where you know, it's certain things like the Midwest.
Yeah.
So it'll be a guy in gaiters that will eat some barbecue ribs with gators on, you know. But definitely a rich culture. So that, and then getting into ministry, that's some different stories. So like you're touching on a couple different things when we think about having an understanding of the Black experience, because I'm guessing that definitely they're leading their journey in ministry connecting with Black folks. So that's
Absolutely.
a diverse group of Black folks, because LA Black folks, or when I think of California, Southern California Black folks, that's also a different thought process too. So to get a little bit of awe really connects with a vast audience.
For sure.
So upon coming back, why do you think your mom wanted to come back to Detroit if she has traveled many different places? What was the calling to come back here? Because at that point, like coming back to Detroit, she's almost like crossing paths of coming back to Detroit, and definitely a form of Black leadership being at the helm. But with that Black leadership, as you know, we talk about on Detroit is different often, you know, the resources begin to get taken away.
Yeah.
You know, the minute a Black person steps into a leadership position, whatever your budget was, you can almost say, cut it in half.
Yeah, so I would say it was my grandmother becoming ill that got my mother to come back. So my parents had separated. My grandmother was sick with cancer, and so it was an opportunity for my mom to come back, help take care of her mom. And so I think there was an idea that we would return back to California. My mom loved it there. And I believe it had to be about maybe 1990 that my grandmother passed away. And so it was kind of made clear, like, we're going to be here for a little bit of a while. So I remember being in elementary school, and I would always say to people, you know, I'm from California, but we're moving back. This is just temporary. You know, I'm just going to be in Detroit for a little bit. And we essentially never went back. And so it took last year, my husband and I were in California for our anniversary, and I went to Pasadena for the first time and went to find my childhood home. So it was really important for me because I had spent my whole life hearing stories about just how beautiful Pasadena was. And my parents would say things like, we used to live right down the street from the Rose Bowl. And I would be like, yeah, they're probably just saying that. So when I find the house, we lived right down the street from the Rose Bowl. Like literally, like in the next block is the Rose Bowl Stadium. And so it was this really amazing moment to see this house, see this neighborhood, and to almost get a glimpse of understanding into my parents that I don't know that I would have had without that moment. Yeah. So the first thing I thought about was how difficult of a decision it must have been to leave California to come back to Detroit. Because, you know, while I love my city, it's nothing like Pasadena, California. It's beautiful, it's warm, and you almost can understand having to go from Pasadena, California to the Sojourner Truth Homes. That's a wide step back, you know what I'm saying? Out of necessity. She came home because she wanted to help take care of her mother. But it made me realize that must not have been an easy decision. So that was one thing. I think the other thing that I thought about was how progressive young black folks were in the 70s and 80s in California when this was at the height of the epidemic, of the crack epidemic. You know, to be in a community, to be thriving and in the, you know, the middle class, that wouldn't have been easy. Rent was high back in the 70s. So when I say that I got a better understanding of my parents, it was like, you don't even know what you would have done back then. And so my dad became a victim of the crack epidemic in about 1985. And so it was one of those things that really changed the trajectory of our family and most people, Black folks' families at that time. So it was kind of, again, one of those times where my mother, I'm sure, had to make a decision of, hey, this isn't the direction I want for my family. And it coincided with her coming back to Detroit to support her mother. So I say that because standing there in that neighborhood and kind of feeling, what at one point would have been my parents in the height, of their success was a really affirming feeling. And it gave me this strange sense of kind of completion that I don't know that I would have ever gotten. You know what I mean? Which is you left a place thinking you would come back to it. And it was a beautiful home, a beautiful neighborhood. I almost wonder what our lives would have been like had we got the opportunity to have grown up in California. But obviously, our path was meant to be something very different.
Yeah, and definitely mutual friend. I just had an interview with DeJuan Dandridge. They may coincide, and I like to give context because, and I know sometimes if everybody that listens and follows every episode will be like, wow, Kari's giving the same point, but these same points are the threads of life that like weave the tapestry of this Black American experience. And one of the things about the struggles that our community had with crack cocaine, like looking back on it, especially like if you grew up listening to hip hop and if you're around our age, like I think if you were born basically like maybe like 68 to about 88, you grew up with hip hop. Like it grew up with you. So it's easy to follow the trajectory of hip hop where like it's looked down upon the person that uses drugs and you idolize the person that sells drugs. Right. And, I don't know if the Just Say No campaign worked, but definitely the Crack is Whack campaign worked. And it lacks the perspective of the way that crack cocaine was, I guess, marketed and presented to the community and just Black America at the time. And that's why I like the show Snowfall, which really kind of takes place in that footprint because it gives, as I told DeJuan, like, and I've said this before, like I say, I'm beating people over the head with this, like cocaine throughout the 70s was a glamour drug. It was like, Cristal champagne or like, sushi, caviar. It was something looked at like opulence and success, and really like the effects of it looking bad, that wasn't really shared with most people. So when we think of what cocaine showed people, it was like, wow, everybody's doing cocaine. Like, and now you have what crack was like a cheaper version of cocaine. So it's almost like when like the luxury cars, you know what I'm saying? It's like, okay, I can't get the S-Class Benz or whatever. I'm not a car person, but I can get this Benz. That's what crack was. Yeah. So people are thinking like, why would people do that? How would people do that? They didn't have a context of understanding the impacts that it would have, especially when, marijuana was already, as it is now, like it was more of a sociable, it's not going to impact your life like that. And just what it did to change a lot of the roles in families. It broke apart families. It made younger people kind of, fall into the position of having a lot of resources, so now, like we look at the story of like a freeway Ricky Ross. You look at a guy that, as he says, like through high school, he's, basically functionally illiterate. He knew how to kind of play some tennis. His tennis coach is the person that kind of introduces him to access to this, to sell cocaine, and he's the person that suggests making crack of it. This connects to like the Iran-Contra deal, like, all of this. But you go from basically being like a 20-year-old that would probably be working at, whatever, menial job, to now becoming the richest person, in southern Los Angeles. and being a part of lending back to, like, because black folks really don't get options from banks. So he's investing in properties. I mean, like what people say, he invested in Anita Baker's first album, but like a lot of those Solar records had a lot of backing from Freeway Ricky Ross. And I mean, not necessarily like a direct connection. It's not like
Sure.
they walked in the room smoky, but the right people knew, hey, we're gonna need some street money to get this off the ground, as that happens for many black businesses because we don't have access to traditional lending. So street lending takes place. But now you have multitudes of basically teenagers and people in their early 20s looked at with the wisdom and the esteem, while people that are older are struggling with this addiction, and it fractures the community.
Yeah.
Exponentially. And I'm sure for someone like you, and you were young, but now you probably can see, because it becomes, seeing it in Los Angeles and then travel to Detroit, you slowly see some of those impacts. And I know that also had to have been like, wow, this is interesting.
Yeah, I think that fortunately I was so young that I didn't fully understand the ramifications of what was happening.
Yeah.
So what I saw my father's addiction translate into is him not being present. And fortunately, my mother was one who never talked bad about him. I didn't know that my dad suffered with a drug addiction until I was much, much, much older. And it took me some years to understand that those periods that he had gone dark were periods where he was battling mental illness or incarceration or housing insecurity and homelessness, all of those things that kind of stem back to a drug addiction. And it took, many years to be able to really repair the relationship with my father, and being angry, all of those things that young, folks will have that experience. But it took me to have my own children to put into perspective how difficult that must have been. So we all know how powerful of a drug crack cocaine was. Once you try it once, you are addicted. So you are no longer the person that you were. At one point, my father became sober. He was able to rebuild his life and his career, and was able to bounce back from that and work to rebuild some of those relationships. But not everybody has that luxury. And so for me, I think growing up in Detroit, I knew that there was some I'd say, I don't say discrepancies, but I knew that there was a difference between the way that we lived, predominantly on the east side of Detroit, that was different than the way that other people live. So I look back and would say things like, we were so poor, I thought we were middle class because everyone was poor.
Yeah.
Everybody around me was poor, to the point where everybody had food stamps, nobody had cars, we all relied on public transportation, or for the most part, not a lot of people we knew owned their homes, or just things that were symptoms of poverty that I just took for granted because I thought everyone lived that way. And it probably took going to a school like Detroit School of the Arts, which was a magnet high school, and you had kids from all across the city going to it, that made me realize, wait a minute, not everybody lives like this. So I was probably in about 9th grade when I started to see, wait a minute, it's kids my age who have a car.
Yeah.
My mama don't even have a car.
Yep.
And I started to be like, there's something different out there. But I never even, for the most part, traveled to the West Side. I was such a diehard Eastsider. I remember, being told, don't go to the West Side because it's not safe over there. And I'll never forget being 18 years old and being like, this is what Telegraph Road looks like? Because I had never seen it. Being that far east, you just don't go to the West Side for no reason. And my biggest fear would have been literally that somebody who knew that I did not know the West Side could pick me up, take me to the West Side, and leave me there, because I would
just be lost.
I've just been lost.
Yeah.
Because that should tell you how far, that was a whole nother world for me. And so I use it as an example because I started creeping my way west, and the more west that I got, the more my territory started to expand. So I got my first apartment when I was 17 in the North End. And I don't even know that we called it the North End back then, but it was on Woodward and Harmon. And it was an opportunity for me to be closer to Marygrove College, where I was going to school. And then so kind of after being a student at Marygrove, I moved to Oak Park. And then from Oak Park, I moved to maybe back to Detroit. But my kind of territory continued to expand further and further away from the west side or from the east side. And not because I didn't no longer wanted to live there, but I started to realize that there was just so much more of the city and the suburbs and the world that I needed to see. But I share that because there are still so many people who are just so hyper local to the community that they are from that they don't realize that they can, even have an impact in another community because you are just so focused on the one that you live in.
Very much so. That reminds me of when we were on a rap tour. We were in New York, and we're walking to the show. We're in Times Square, and it was my homie. I just saw him, Mayo Thomas Akan, in Vegas now and everything. And we're walking through, and I've been to Times Square before, right? And it's like maybe about 10 of us. We're walking through, and I'm just, I'm like trying to get to the show to make sure things are coordinated, because like if you've ever done any hip hop shows, and especially I got like all these people, it's like they got to perform. I want to make sure that the DJ has their music, and my mind is focused on that, right? So we're walking, and I'm walking through Times Square, and anybody that's ever been to Times Square, it's like sensory overload. It's like a Las Vegas casino almost, like all these lights, stores, people. And this is around the time like when they first shut down Times Square, where like cars aren't driving through and everything. So it's, they have the big steps and all of this stuff. I'm just walking to get to the show, and I turn around and like nobody else is behind me. Like they're way back, right? And I'm like, yo, why are y'all taking all day? Like we got to get here. And then Kyle was like, man, these people ain't never been nowhere. And then that's when my man, and right now he travels everywhere. My man Dutch, he was like, yo, man, I ain't never been nowhere other than Cedar Point. Yeah. I got to take this in. And it made me kind of stop and think. I'm like, damn, you know what I'm saying? He like, one of them people, I don't even go to the east side. He was a west sider that just didn't travel to the east side. So now I have him in Times Square. Other than Cedar Point, he's never been anywhere else. And it's like, wow, I guess you're right. Because I couldn't fathom, being like, this is your first time.
Yeah.
And everything. So like it's many stories like that. And some of this I think goes back to as people say, you need exposure. Some of the things that are now labeled as toxic, and in some ways they can have, I don't like to label them toxic, but they can have some detrimental impacts, but they started from safety reasons.
Right.
It was a point in time, like some of the people on the east side, like black folks knew. You go to the west side, you're going to run into problems.
For sure.
You go to certain communities, you're going to run into problems. So it started as like a defense mechanism to not end up in trouble.
For sure. I will agree that the advice that I would get about going to the west side was more around being aware of your surroundings, being with people that you know. So the safety and the comfort of being in your own neighborhood was really to protect you.
Yes.
This was also around the time when I talked about white flight, where there was literally a fence that went along 8 Mile. Yeah. And it was meant to remind you that you should not be on this other side of 8 Mile if you don't belong here. So growing up in a community where it was very commonplace, where people didn't have a driver's license or your tags were bad, it was also a way to keep you out of those communities, because for sure, if you cross 8 Mile, you are going to be pulled over, arrested, going to jail. And we would know people who that would happen to. So thinking about kind of the invisible fence of sorts that you get is, well, I can't go north to the suburbs because I'm not supposed to be there. That's not safe. I can't go west because that's not safe. So the only place that is safe is if I stay on the east side. And so there was a comfort and a familiarity from, we used to ride our bikes all over. Wherever we lived, we'd be just riding, all up to Hoover and Shaner and, Eastland Mall and that kind of stuff. But there was safety and comfort because we knew that. But to that same point, it really did take me to be in adulthood before I could feel that same level of comfortability on the west side. And so I have used that to even translate my experience as to why I've wanted to see so much of the world. So my husband and I do a lot of travel. We particularly love international travel. And I found myself in Beijing, China. So my husband and I got married in Beijing in 2016. And I found myself on the Great Wall of China saying, I am a girl from the east side of Detroit. What am I doing here? And it was so mind-boggling because, again, it made me realize how limiting we try to make the boundaries of community be for people. So again, the folks who were telling me that were saying that to keep me safe. I don't want anything to happen to you. So stay right here in your little neighborhood. But it's really been kind of the opposite effect, where it has made me want to see more of the world. And I have now been working to create the kind of life for myself where I can be a world traveler. And I say that because every time I go to a new place or a new space, there is a certain level of humility that I have to have, of learning and education. You can't just, because you're an American, you can't just come to a new place and all of a sudden think you can take it over. But it really does compel me to think about it's a bit more beyond just exposure. We can expose young kids to travel and let them see the world. But I think there's another element to how do we remove some of the mental fences that we tend to impose on people when we ask them to just, stay in their comfort zone, which might be the confines of their neighborhood.
I agree, and I definitely agree with you. I just like to always give context. Like sometimes it's like Piper Carter here will be like, "You're the biggest cheerleader for old Black thought." I am, and I'm also a big cheerleader, obviously from the Black male perspective, because sometimes I think it can get blanketed as if like, "Oh, that was backwards. Why would you do that?" And no, it had a context at one point in time, and I'm not saying that it's like everything. Everything has context and perspective. It's not like the origin of where your great-grandmother was coming from. And I'm not saying you, but like all of us, it was to harm us.
Yeah.
At one point in time, especially when it came to like, the Green Book and everything like that, it's just certain neighborhoods and certain communities. I would say definitely even certain parts of Michigan. As a truck driver that's traveled a lot of Michigan. It's certain places where I do, I don't think you're going to get your head bashed in per se, but it's certain places that are, you're not from around here.
Yeah.
And when you feel that presence and then you may not have the for me, I think that my gift of gab is probably one of my strong suits, and understanding the empathy of people, body language, but this comes from interacting with a lot of different people. You know what I mean? Truck driving, especially those southern routes. I saw Confederate tattoos all the time. Some of them, as much as I could consider it, like homies, different perspectives, but you still, it still takes a keen awareness. And if you're not as familiar in being in new spaces and understanding those cultures, like you say, that humility, then yes, it can exponentially become very, very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
So that kind of moves to your mom. So she comes back for caretaking. And caretaking, if for anybody that we know, like when we think about one of the key gateways to poverty in America is dealing with some catastrophic illness. But that catastrophic illness does have impacts on others. As many people's story is, I came back for caretaking. Which is something that I tip my hat if you're ever in that situation. And I think more resources are being developed because, as they always say, sometimes the caretaker, it ends up, it will impact them more so. What was your mother doing when she came here? How was she dealing with being in that role? Because it's always even more difficult when you like go from child to parent, and then it kind of becomes like you're like a parent. You kind of become a parent to your parent in certain ways.
So I'd like to think that my mom moved here. She was doing mostly corporate work. I remember her working at the wellness plan for a while. And I think she was about 35 when my grandmother passed away. So I put that into perspective because she's a single mom, 4 kids, and 35. And that she would have been younger than I am today, taking on that type of responsibility. And so I recognize having been, and I'd say she's an only child, but she has older siblings or older half siblings, but really the only child at home to take care of her mother. Must have been really difficult. My grandfather was still alive, and I think he survived probably about another 15 years after that time period. So it was moving on from taking care of her mother and then to just supporting her father in a different way. So my grandfather. And, I really attribute my grandfather in particular as being one of the most important men in my life. So we were very special to him, my siblings and I, but in particular, my twin sister and I were really special to my grandfather. And there was a certain level of presence and I'd say almost fortitude that came with being around my grandfather. And I remember it being so tough and abrasive when I was a teenager, and I hated it. So in between our different moving around and whatever, we would come back and stay with my grandfather. So when I lived in these different neighborhoods, people would never really put two and two together that if they saw us back with my grandfather, it meant we had been through an eviction somewhere else. But my grandfather's house was always the safe spot. So we might have been going through something.
And that's that Jefferson Chalmers area.
Absolutely. So at one point, we lived in the Jefferson Chalmers area. We'd go back to that. But then at some point, the house that my grandfather actually helped my mom buy, the house that was on Rossini, which was like the State Fair and Gratiot area. At some point, my grandfather takes that house, sells the house over on Navajo, and the house on State Fair and Gratiot became the family home. So anytime that we would move to a different neighborhood, something would happen with the house, we'd be right back on Rossini. So for a long time, that neighborhood felt like my nucleus neighborhood. It was the place I could walk to the corner store. All my friends lived there. And it was just a really safe space for us. So we essentially had that as our family home until my grandfather passed away. And then even at one point, my mother ended up having a house down the street from my grandfather. So we've always been kind of in close proximity to each other. And again, I would say that, sometimes our friends wouldn't put two and two together. We'd come back every year because we had some type of housing insecurity somewhere else. We'd come back here, get ourselves together. So my grandfather was always this really important person. And I can specifically remember around the times I was like 13, 14, 15 years old. He had so many different rules and he was so tough. But I can really appreciate that type of, parenting now, because I find myself at almost 40 saying the same things that my grandfather used to say, and he would be so tough on us. But it was the kind of thing that you don't want to hear as a kid, but you need to hear, because it's like I can attribute most of my success to my parents and to my grandfather especially. And I can even think to different things that I do or that I have or I've experienced. And I'll be thinking my grandfather would be so proud of me, because he made the path so clear about just being a good person, being fiscally responsible, taking care of your business, and, and just doing the right thing by people. And so, to this day, I make decisions with my grandfather kind of in my rear view of what would my grandfather think about this? And if it was something that he were alive to say, now, you ain't got no business doing that, I wouldn't do it, So I think about how that is almost a lost thing that we don't have. A lot of families don't grow up with those strong elders or folks in their family who can be that for their family, in that case, the patriarch of their family, that can, lead that influence for generations. Like my kids are still reaping dividends from the things that my grandfather put into me,
Yeah, and it's unique because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about some of those figures in my family. Like, so I already feel the energy that was one of those granddads that, like, you're at granddad's house, you leave a Ninja Turtle out or whatever, and you go to sleep, and he gonna wake you up and be like, hey. Where's things supposed to go? And you be like, hey, man, damn. You know what I'm saying? He tripping. So I think some of that same disconnect may even happen in that journey because, and this is fragmented families that come together, and then families have their own community and culture. Mm-hmm. So, like, it seems like, oh, granddad. Oh,
well, I'll give you this perfect example because this is one that I still use to this day. So my grandfather would say, I lock my doors at 9:00. Deadbolt, if you're not in here, you're not coming in, okay? And so again, as of now, 15, 16-year-old, oh my God, my grandpa is tripping. And so there was one day that I did not make it into the house by 9:00, and I did not get in. And he literally said, like, I'm not raising no hoes, is what he said to me. Like, if you're not in here by 9:00. And I remember being like, what kind of thing is that to say to your granddaughter?
Yeah.
And almost, 25 years later, I find myself saying, my door is locked at 9:00. You not in here, you're not in here.
Hilarious.
And it's the sense of also going back to what you said about safety.
Yes.
Right? If I let my kids traipse in here at any old time of the night, they're subject to not be safe. No telling what they're doing. So I found myself laughing one time about that. And I said, I don't know about raising no hoes, but it was definitely this idea of like, I want you to be a classy young lady who don't stay out at night is basically the point he was making. So, and I got that because I was never the person coming in past 9 o'clock. But even with my own kids, I do think that there are those things that we unconsciously find ourselves, lending to our own parenting based on the way that we were raised. And so again, my grandfather would have been the person who would say, again, you want your place where you live to be safe. You want it to operate a certain way. If people can't follow by that, then they don't need to be there, Yeah. And so again, I'm just grateful for that because especially in this season of my life, I can hear my grandfather beaming in pride of like making the right decisions, doing the right things for the family, taking care of the family. Those are all things that give me a lot of pride in this phase of my life.
And I like you shared that. And I even like that you gave that comment because those are sometimes the comments I'll defend and they'll say, that's such toxic masculinity. And I'm like, look, I'm not going to stand up for the comment, but you still have to understand the context and the perspective that led to him feeling that way and saying that so bluntly.
Right.
Like it's a cultural. Because something that weighs on my heart is sometimes when people from outside our community speak on the ways that how our family should function. And I'm saying you can take bits and pieces of it, but unless you're from our culture, you won't understand the context of where that's coming from.
That's right.
And we can't like throw the baby out with the bathwater, quote unquote. And that's why I think a lot of elders, men and women, sometimes walk away and say, look, I just give up because, I'm in fights with you when, sometimes the way they say things are very antiquated, can be not how you want them. It's like, hey, don't nobody talk to me like this, granddad. I don't care who you are. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But it's a place and space for the elders to exist in our family structure where we have to kind of lend an ear to some of what they're saying, push back humbly because their position as an elder in our community. And then over time, it's surprising because they sometimes will, as time goes on and they see things function, they'll open up and they'll say, all right, I still sort of don't agree from what I know and what I think is safe, but I see that things are moving along well. And it's not like just such a zero-sum game because our communities, as far as I'm concerned, like that black family structure, it takes that whole tapestry. It takes the people you don't get along with.
Correct.
It takes, because really it's the observation of children that notice, okay, I see, my aunts don't necessarily get along, but they can come together for a Christmas.
Yeah.
I see my cousins may not like each other, but it is certain things that they do, my elders can bring them together. And then that builds a foundation, I think, moving forward. As people always say, whatever happened to Big Mama? Whatever happened to Big Mama? A lot of Big Mamas just, said no mas.
Yeah, well, I would even say in being, our age at this point, it's going to be a matter of time before we are the elders.
Yes.
And so I was just making the comment of how seriously I take the role in my family of kind of being a stabilizer of sorts. So I have, family all across the country, and we have a pretty small family as it is. But I do take a lot of pride in being somebody that is consistent and dependable in our family for my kids and for my nieces and nephews, because I do think that Big Ma role is somebody chose to be that. And it might not have been the grandma or the auntie, but there were some decisions that person kind of had to make. Okay, you're going to have holidays at my house. Or I'm going to be the person people come to when they're in distress. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's all stuff I want to do, but I think about that from a way of when we look back through our families, it's not a coincidence that it's that particular person. And it looks a little different in each family, but I think about how intentional it must have been for those people to say, you know what, there's a lot of chaotic things happening in our family, but I'm going to be the person who lives in the same house for 30 years so that people always have a place to be. I have those folks in my family. And I think we take for granted when we see it, but you don't really stop to think about why those people are so important in the family. And you generally don't get a bunch of them. But when you do have them, I think about an aunt that I have that, Whether you have talked to her in a year, 5 years, or 10 years, everybody in the family knew they could go to her house, whether it was for a holiday or they could stay in the basement or whatever that might be. So as we get older, I stop to think about the kind of role that I want to play in my family. I was with my family just about a week ago in Baltimore, and I thought about how all of these people, my children, my siblings, now my great niece, all of these generations of people who came from my mother, from one person. And again, I think it's my own age and mortality creeping up on me, but I was able to stop and think, Lord willing, 20 years from now, you're going to be standing in the kitchen and see your children and their children and all of the things that come from just your lineage, right? So I think there's something really powerful about getting older and more mature and being able to value that time is coming for me, and really asking myself, what kind of legacy do I want to leave for my kids and my family, and who do I want to be? So it's definitely something I give a lot of thought to.
And it's powerful and it's needed, because like that space, when we look at it, and it's tough sometimes too, because in that aging process, you may look at that family member and be like, oh man, they taking advantage of you, they exploiting you and everything. But I like you touched on the word chaos. Being Black in America is a chaotic situation. So it's going to be certain things that happen, even for us that seem, the most well put together and upwardly mobile. It's certain things that you need that wisdom of that person that understands, even sometimes when it's not spoken.
Yeah.
They can tell, like, when you reach out and talk to them on the phone. My granny in Cincinnati, Lord knows, it's so funny. And my grandma in Cleveland, they're the exact opposite in the sense of, like, sometimes, like, one's always pessimistic, one's always optimistic and everything. But it's still wisdom and game. And they've seen so much in life that you can, whatever the details, they don't understand podcasts and YouTube and all of that stuff. But then when I start talking about the people and what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and they'll, tell different stories that do connect. Like my grandma in Cincinnati, Emma Jean. So Emma Jean she went to high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. She had the option of being one of the students to like, I guess, break the color line. So, we were talking about the Jerry Jones incident, because I was like, you were down there then. And then, like, my grandma laughed for a second and she spoke. And I was like, well, he just says he was in the crowd for curiosity. If people don't know, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys at the time when this is like around the Brown versus Board of Education, the racial barriers were being broken for students to enter a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is the same time when my grandma is attending the Black school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then I was just like, I just don't believe that. Like, why would you? The National Guard had to come. You're just curious. You want to see? Nah, he had to be a part of that mob. And just the way she laughed, and she said, well, the way them white folks were then, and basically what she's saying is everybody white was in the crowd. Right. You know what I'm saying? She just had a way to, like, cut through. And it's that same type of logic, and then flip it to say, yeah, but so that's why I stayed at my school, but then I needed to get a job, which basically saying sometimes you're going to have to engage with, the opposition, them white folks that didn't want you to come to the school. And it's a way to engage. And I can tap right into that wisdom instead of just looking at, like, oh, I just must, watch a bunch of YouTube videos of what's happening now and how the YouTube people deal with what's happening if a story is suppressed and all of that stuff. That wisdom is deep.
Yeah.
On to the pivot. So Marygrove. And Marygrove, you have even a deeper connection with Marygrove now. But why did you choose Marygrove? And you were there at 17. So that means that you were double promoted, as people know. So, or you had like one of those birthdays where your mom was like, you could be like the youngest kid in school. And it's like, yeah, go on and let her go in school,
Well, interestingly, I was at the Detroit School of the Arts through the start of my senior year. I found out I was pregnant in August before my senior year started, and I had a big decision to make, which is I had a 9 to 4 schedule in high school. So I knew I couldn't work. I wouldn't be able to do a lot. And I remember there being a lot of stairs at Marygrove. And I remember not Marygrove, but DSA. And I remember thinking, I'm going to be pregnant most of my senior year, and I don't know that I want to do it here. So I was able to go to an alternative school.
Did you go to Catherine Ferguson?
I did not go to Catherine Ferguson. It was an alternative school in Macomb County. And it was just on the other side of 8 Mile from where I was living at the time.
So it was like the Macomb County version of Catherine Ferguson.
Kind of, because it was more of an alternative school, and not everybody there had kids. So it was kind of interesting because when I went there to take the test to kind of get in, I had a 4.0 grade point average. And I took the written exam, and the principal sat me and my mother down and was like, why are you here? We can't really, we were looking at your transcripts. This doesn't make any sense why you're choosing to spend your senior year here. And I was pregnant. I was about maybe a couple months pregnant, maybe, but not showing or anything. And so I was like, oh, I'm kind of pregnant. And so they're like, okay. So because my grades were so stellar, they created a customized curriculum for me. So I only needed 6 weeks of classroom instruction to get my diploma early. So while everybody else was doing regular assignments, I literally learned how to type for 6 weeks. So I used this particular curriculum. All I did for 6 weeks was learn how to type. And I was hunting and pecking. And within 6 weeks, I was doing like 80 words a minute. So I graduated probably by November of what would have been my senior year. I got a job, and I literally was walking home one day from the high school, walked past what used to be Clyde's Carpet on 8 Mile, and let's say maybe like near Gratiot. And I saw a now hiring sign in the window. And because this is how I used to get jobs back then. There would be a sign in the window, and you go in, and they're like, okay. And I got a $10 an hour job working at Clyde's Carpet for the remainder of my senior year. So from November through probably April, when I gave birth to my son, I was working at a carpet store, and I was the cashier. And I remember doing the job and saving my money and like trying to think of a plan because I knew I wanted to go to college, which was at that time was Marygrove. And then I ended up getting a full scholarship in the honors program to go to Marygrove College.
That's deep. What stood out about Marygrove?
I actually wanted to go to Arizona State University. I remember, this is kind of silly, but I had to be about 13 years old when I first saw the movie Waiting to Exhale. And there was this scene that Whitney Houston is driving through the desert. And I was like, wherever that is, that's where I want to go.
Okay.
And I found out that it was, I think it was one of the Sonoran deserts. And I remember saying Arizona State University is there. That's where I'm going to go. So I sent off for these brochures. So literally from 9th through 12th grade, I had it in my heart that I was going to go to Arizona State University. When I found out that I was pregnant, that felt impossible. Yeah. And so even though I had a really strong grade point average, Marygrove College was the only college I applied to. It was mostly because I had 2 aunts, or a cousin and an aunt, who had both went through Marygrove. And in their own way, they said, that's the place that you need to be. And I respected them enough to say, if they're telling me to go to Marygrove, that's where I should be. And I loved it. It changed my life for so many different reasons. It was just what I needed, which was small classroom sizes. We never had lecture hall, so every class would have been, no more than 20 people, for example. And the professors know you by name, your friends know you by name, and it always felt like home. It was very anxiety producing when I think about it. I used to have a lot of panic attacks because I would be
the youngest person, because that's the other thing.
Yeah.
I think. But 2 things I want to point out. This is further that connection of elder and young person, because just that observation of hey, auntie, what you think about this? And that's you know what I'm saying? That's that pivot of check out Marygrove.
Yeah.
But also, when you're the youngest person in a school, because I've done schools with being that young person, and then I've also flipped. I've been the old person in the school too. It can be overwhelming. You're going from high school, you're a teenager, and then these people are grown, yeah, I just got off work.
Oh, they're for sure grown. Marygrove was a commuter school, so it was a handful of 18-year-olds in those classes, but it was mostly adults. I can distinctly remember having classes with 80-year-old people and being like, wow, your mind is so sharp that you want to be in school at 80 years old. So I think that was a very different dynamic for sure. It was more of a mature place to be. I also had a kid. It would be times I would bring my kid to school. And then I worked at Marygrove. So I would literally catch 3 buses from the east side of Detroit. This was before I moved to the north end. And I would literally catch 3 buses, go to Marygrove, do my work study job, take 3 more buses, and do it all over again. And I probably did that for at least a year or so before I got my apartment with my cousin. And when we got the apartment, it was an opportunity to be a little closer to Marygrove, but also to really kind of step out on my own and really start to decide, okay, what kind of life do I want to live for myself? And I remember just still being so mature, even at 18, 19, having this apartment. And my cousin and I would have friends that would come over, and I would be like, y'all got to go. I got homework to do. I was always very serious and very studious. So sometimes it's no surprise that people hear kind of what I'm up to these days and are like, whatever.
Because she was on that path.
Very much so. Very much so.
But for everybody watching, if you got young people or whatever, and she's going to attest to this, at least I feel she's going to echo this. If you are, depending upon where your silliness is, because I definitely was silly. So if you go to a school where you are like that youngest person around nothing but grown folks, I mean, it's going to be a couple laughs and stuff, but it ain't Saved by the Bell to college years.
No.
So it will immediately stick you to, like, you're going to shape up because these are grown people. They got grown stuff to do.
Yeah.
You a kid, you may have kid stuff to do, but it's gonna break that pattern, and you're gonna be in there and in that mix. Because a couple of my classes at Lewis College of Business were like that, and I was like, damn, these people is, you know what I'm saying? I took a day class where it was like basically nothing but like early 20 something, and I was like, it felt like high school again.
Yeah.
But other than that, every other class was like, you're in here with serious people. It's a class project. We're not talking about Jay-Z album and stuff. It's like, hey, what we doing, what we working on. And I think that shapes up the mind of a student in a different way. So I would suggest if you have that kid, and you're in a community college, I'm a community college guy, think about taking some night classes too. Don't just think about taking early classes, because just being exposed around some of the adults and the way that they, will ask questions and go about studying, it can be eye-opening to just even see different variations of what grown up looks like.
For sure. I remember having just some amazing folks that I got to learn with and who were generous to me, who would give me rides. I was just sharing this as a laugh with a friend of mine, Alea Harvey Quinn, who went to Marygrove with me. And fast forward all these years later, the work that she's doing is an outbirth of who she was 20 years ago. And so she said, it was a time where when she didn't have a car, I would take her. When I didn't have a car, she would take me. Like people who were my age, who I found that affinity with. And I'm so grateful for those long-term relationships. But it was mostly people who were really serious, who had kids and families and jobs. And it just kind of helped that sense of this, we don't have a lot of time, here to be playing around. And so I think that partly helped inspire why I started my first business. I was still in undergrad at Marygrove when I started my first business. So I was 21 years old. I started a farmer's insurance agency in my basement and then transferred that to Farmington Hills. Okay. And within a year of selling insurance, I was a top producing agent.
Wow. That's deep. So with that entrepreneurship, what was that connection? Were you going to school for something like that? Or was it just an opportunity? It seems like, this is a niche. I think I can do it.
Yeah, it was an opportunity. So by the time I'm 21, I had gotten married. I was on my second child. So I was doing all of this while being an undergrad. And it was my husband at the time who was looking for kind of an entrepreneurial pursuit. He had been an entrepreneur before. And I actually said I never wanted to be an entrepreneur. So kind of growing up the way that I did.
Time out. For everybody that knows Racheal, Lord knows, that's almost like a
blasphemous
soundbite that live in infamy.
Seriously. So I'm gonna say something about that because this is really, really powerful. I remember being 19 years old and I set an intention for my life, which was I had, from the time that I was 13 through 18 years old, we had probably been evicted about 5 or 6 times. And when I say evicted, I don't mean move. I mean, we had to move, but bailiffs came and we were evicted. So multiple times I would come home from school and I left in the morning, was perfectly fine.
Everything outside.
And everything is outside. So that was really traumatic. And when I think about my life, some of the most traumatic memories were tied to being evicted because you lose all of the things that you find valuable or precious. You have you lose a sense of security and safety with something as basic as where you live and where you can come home to. So it was very chaotic in that way.
And then the shame and embarrassment, like when you see people get evicted, like, your neighbors are looking.
Absolutely.
And when you're younger, it's tougher.
Oh my
so
gosh.
people kind of turn their back, but they looking, like you see the shades open up.
Absolutely. In fact, my brother has this traumatic experience. My brother has since passed away, but he came home on the school bus on his birthday, and we had been evicted that day. So all the kids on the bus saw him be evicted. And so it's that kind of shame that you're like, it's a very traumatic experience that I don't know that people really understand. So for me, it was, I'm getting out of this cycle, because it's really a cycle. Once you get into a series of, missed payments, and it's really easy to stay on that.
Yeah.
And again, it took me some years to understand how that works, but it's so common because it can happen to anybody, right? And so I remember being about 19. So I had gotten my own place, and I said, what my intention for my life at 19 years old, I wanted to live in the same house forever. I wanted to drive a Taurus, and I wanted to be a teacher so that I could get paid every 2 weeks. And I remember saying that so regularly that people who knew me was like, first off, we don't believe it, but that you would have set an intention that for me, being who I am, was in that way was comforting. It was to say, I just want to live in the same house forever. So when I bought my first home at 21, the idea was I'm never leaving here, and my kids will never leave here, because I want them to live in one house for their whole life and know what that feels like. Now, by the grace of God, I still have that home and our family, and my kids have grown up in the same house their whole life, right? In addition to moving to different communities. I did get the Taurus. I did become a teacher, but so many other things happened in my life. So when I started the first business, I was so reluctant about doing it because it was the unknown. And I really didn't want to, but I went ahead with it. And I realized that it was something that I could do well. Again, I took it for granted that those are sales skills and customer service and business. But what I realized was I liked having the flexibility to make my own money. And so to be 21 years old making six figures, I remember most months I made at least $10,000 a month at 21 years old. I bought myself a Cadillac at 23 years old. And it was like not because I was being flashy. It was because I could at that point. That was where I really got a taste for I like being the author of my own destiny. And I love being able to say what I have the desire to do, I can do. And so I stayed in entrepreneurship for a while, created a number of businesses. And then when I transitioned out of my first marriage, I went back into education, was able to have a very successful career in schools. I became a school principal by the time I was like 27, 28 years old. I transitioned into central office administration. So I ran what was one school, then 3 schools, then 15 schools. And then I was able to come back to entrepreneurship as a way for me to marry the two. So I was able to build my career off of what I learned in my corporate career. And so now I am in entrepreneurship full time and doing a number of business ventures that, really set my soul on fire. And I think that I recognize how much of a privilege it is to do work that sets your soul on fire. So many times we do jobs because we have to, right? When I was a single mom with my own 4 kids, I worked many a job that I hated. I went to schools and I'd be like, my stomach hurt pulling in the parking lot, but it paid the bills and I had to take care of my family. So I recognize how much of a privilege it is to be in a space where I get to do things that I'm excited about. I get to spend my time and my days how I want to. I get to be paid handsomely for the work that I get to do. And then I get to help people. So I don't know that there's anything better that I could be doing professionally than what I'm doing today.
That's deep. I often say my biggest joy in this is the autonomy. And that autonomy, that freedom to do, because that's it definitely comes with consequence. I mean, but if I want to take a day off and say, you know what, I'm going to just watch Black Panther 2 4 times in a row at the movie theater, I have that opportunity without that same level of stress or anxiety of a person hey, where you at? What's going on? So I enjoy and embrace that. And you're right, making decisions out of circumstance or when you feel their circumstance versus choice, it's two totally different worlds.
Yeah.
And going back to even the facing eviction and just the lack of money and what that can be for many people. I mean, I'm looking at my DTE bill as I brought that up, and I think to myself, like, as much as it's like, wow, it's gonna be tight, and I can pay this, but I really think about my neighbors, that are, and it's like, especially in a neighborhood like mine, it's like, if my bill is this high, I know their bill is this high.
Right.
And if they're not giving like the hula hoops and the work, because, people make it seem like it's just, the government's just giving money to these people.
Yeah.
No, it's a lot of work. And then even the barriers of entry, it's like that movie Claudine or something, to stay where it's like, okay, to, as they say, functionally poor.
Sure.
So like sometimes to get assistance, you have to be so impoverished you can't even be functionally poor.
Right.
So you got to like pick up odd jobs. You make us pound cakes on the side, and you know what I'm saying? Like, hey, you want to buy my brother car, and I can get half of that. Or, like it's a very it becomes a culture in itself.
Yeah.
But it's oppressive, it's aggressive, it's violent. And one of the things I always say is like, I'm willing to, and I think many people in my community are, I'm willing to pay a little bit more because I can afford to, if that keeps my neighbor across the street.
Right.
And I think that's more in the black culture of us, because it's not in other cultures to be like, if they're like, I want to pay what that person's paying. It's like, nah, I don't mind paying a little bit more if it keeps my community together. And also, I mean, if they have 5 kids over there, I'm single man, so it's a different barrier of responsibility that I have to keep going what I got to keep going, though I do want to keep this going and everything. So in making those decisions around comfortability and finding that comfortability and that stability as a quality of life, which are key, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But also now you kind of tap more into like a passion too.
Sure. So I'm sorry to cut you off here. I think that this is why I acknowledge that tapping into passion is a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
There were for sure years where I was so poor I couldn't make the ends meet. So we're talking out of childhood. So get out of childhood, make it to adulthood. As a single mom, I had a mortgage. I had all these responsibilities. I've been on welfare twice. And I can remember what it was like to make decisions about buying groceries or paying a light bill.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in those seasons of my life, it was really lean time. So I can remember a Christmas, one of the first Christmases that I was divorced, and I had no money to buy a single gift for my kids. Mm. So I sent them to their dad's house so that they would, I knew they would get gifts from there, but that they might forget that they didn't get any from me that year,
Mm-hmm.
So I say that because I think that there is something that growing up in poverty gave me, which is a certain level of resiliency that I didn't know I would need in other phases of my life. Because I think when you grow up poor, you think, well, that's fine. When I be an adult, I'm not going to be poor.
Good.
Yeah, I'm going to be good. This is never going to happen to me again. And I can remember the time that I like played around with DTE and let them shut me off and having to be like, now, what did my mother do? What do I remember about being a kid that I can do here? And in that case, the one time my lights were shut off, I sent my kids to go spend a night somewhere and I paid the bill and it was on the next day and they never knew the lights were off, right? So some of that gave me some training and preparation for when times would get really lean. But what it also gave me was a really strong sense of appreciation for how to move and maneuver out of poverty, because it's so many things other than how much money you make. It is a mindset. It is how you spend your money. It is the decisions you make about money. It's the relationship that you have with money. It's all of those things. And I can say this having been a person who has moved through every phase of that. So even when people have been surprised that I have left a corporate career to do entrepreneurship full time, yes, that is a privilege. But what I also know is there is a responsibility that comes when you have figured out and somewhat mastered some of those same concepts. You have a responsibility to show other people how to do it. So if I can tell you how to get off welfare, right? I know how to do that. Again, having to be in the welfare line twice in my life, I knew how to get off of welfare. I also know how to scale businesses into, multiple 6 and 7 figures. So I say that because it's important for me now to not just make more money, But to live the quality of life that I desire, which is a simple life, make it, you'd be surprised at the level of simpleness that comes as you get older. I don't need my days to be super full. I don't need to be doing all the things. I don't need to be at all the things. I just want to have a really strong impact, and I want to help my community, and I want to do it in my own way. But now I meet entrepreneurs who are in the struggle and they're trying to figure out how to operate their businesses. And I wake up every day being like, you know what? I'm on fire to help people figure that part out. Because what we don't talk about enough is here is what real entrepreneurship is going to look like. Because when it was happening to me, I thought, man, I must not be that good at this stuff because I'm struggling, right? Why am I still at check and go? Or why is my account overdrawn or whatever? Or why is my credit bad? Well, no, let's talk about this because those are just parts of the journey.
I agree. And I like even how you introduced that whole concept of relationship with money. And like I often tell people, I feel a little guilty in this entrepreneurship because of my father, my grandfather. It's been around me, but it still didn't internalize. Until I think it internalized faster with me because I can see it. And I can call my dad like, hey, da-da-da-da, you know what I'm saying? And da-da-da-da. Like, and I pass that on to my project manager, my team. You know, I love Suzanne Clegg. And we talk. That's why we started this business breakfast club thing, because it's like certain things I just see because I've been around it and I've seen it enough. But that relationship with money, I want to say, and people wonder, it's like, why do people go so broke? Like even these NBA players, because when your relationship with money isn't scarcity, you have you feel like, I don't know when I'm gonna get this again, so I need a Rolex. I don't know when I'm gonna get this again, so I need these red bottoms. I don't know when I'm gonna get this again. So, you know, when I go to the party, I'm gonna buy a booth for everybody. Like it's almost like you feel as though it's going to be taken away
For sure.
as soon as I get it. So let me at least get something out of it.
Yes.
So I feel like all this hard work and my head down and I worked hard and I can walk back to the neighborhood and it's like, yo, check out the rollie, you know, and it ain't ticking. And now, you know, 3 months down the line, you like, damn, how much can I sell this rollie for? You know what I'm saying? And now you're in the pawn shop because it's all types of things that happen in poverty. You know, pawn shop, borrowing money from this person, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And like you say, even just that fear of like, okay, I'm getting government assistance because I make $24,000 a year. And it's this new job opportunity. I don't know if I could stay there. They're offering $30,000 a year. So technically on paper, it's like, okay, I have the opportunity to make more, but do I want to stay here? And, you know, these are the decisions that are going on as you're making these decisions.
For sure. I'm going to tell you, there was a time where I said, I don't know how people buy groceries without a bridge card. I remember thinking, how is that possible? Like with all these kids, who's buying this much in groceries? So there was definitely a time where I needed the assistance I was getting because the ends weren't meeting. But I've definitely grown with having to have a more positive relationship with my money. And I'll say this very candidly, that like people think that the more money you make, the less problems you have.
No.
I will tell you, the more complicated your problems become. And money tends to just be a resource to help you solve those problems faster. And if you aren't careful, then the money becomes, you become at war with the money because now you're spending so much of it that you have to work just as hard to keep making more money. It feels a bit like a Ponzi scheme, right?
Yes.
You got to keep bringing in new money to pay off the old stuff. So as I've worked, particularly in this entrepreneurship space, it's how do I help people have a healthy relationship with their money that says you want to be able to charge more, save more, so you can sleep better at night. So you can get some of that anxiety out of your system, because the more wild that we tend to be with our money, the more anxiety we tend to have. And now we're making business decisions based on money, right? So I typically will say, I don't go after the work I do because of how much money it makes. I go after the energetic alignment, how it makes me feel. I don't take projects for money. In fact, I've turned down more work than I've probably taken. Because if it's just about money, then I'm not going to show up and be the best person I can be for that work anyway. And so it's definitely been a long road to get there. But I say that because I meet so many entrepreneurs who are actively in the struggle. You ask any small business owner, what's your number one challenge? They're going to tell you money and funding. Where do I go get it? And most of what I teach people through some of our programming is I want you to make your money in the services that you provide. Do not expect somebody to come save you because they're not coming. I've been very fortunate where I haven't had to borrow a ton of money to run my business. And I've only taken out one small business loan and it was very nominal. But I say that because I know that's a privilege. The other part is I don't care how much money I've had or how good my credit has been. It's been times where I've been denied for loans.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that to say, even when somebody is saying, okay, I'm doing the right things, I'm trying to go knock on these doors and they're not opening, I tell people, don't even focus on that. Focus on just doing your business well and generating positive and consistent revenue, because that's going to be what's going to get you through the door. Not these people who are promising to come save us, you know?
And even in that, I like that you shared that. Like, in making that relationship, because you're right, it's the mentality that you're shifting. Like, I look at most decisions and I say, okay, I need to lower my overhead. That's how I look at things, but it's from my grandfather and my dad. So instead of like heightening my overhead, and sometimes it's like, okay, I know I can take this impact, I can take this risk, and it's tough because, you know, it's propaganda, it's media. You know, you turn on the news and then you see like some 12-year-old that does exactly what you do, and they're on the Today Show, and it's like, yeah, you know, Amazon just signed a $50 million deal, and you like, man, how that 12-year-old doing? How did he get on? You know what I'm saying? And it's like, you know, so it's very tough because you're thinking you're not moving along. I honor business as far as how I look at it, of the granddad-dad thing. Like, I don't look at who makes the most money. I always, like, people are now mad at Elon Musk, but I always looked at him like he was an idiot. I honor businesses that have been in business the longest.
That's right.
So if you can be in business the longest and you can operate at whatever, like sometimes the goal, like you say, it's not making the most money, but it's basically being able to, I call it making plays. You can make the plays that you want to make. It's some old school businesses that are out here that you don't even know that have relationships so intrinsically aligned. Like, I'm so connected to Hot Sam's, and as I keep going, Cliff or Tony call me, it's whatever. And I'm not the only person like that with Hot Sam's. But they've been around long enough where they've built the tradition and they have the network. But they're operating at the risk aversion.
That's right.
One of those classic business terms that they would like to operate. Because sometimes when you bring on those bigger projects for a lot of money, it's going to be other stresses. And also when you flaunt your money, that's the other thing. Life becomes more transactional.
That's right.
So like if LeBron James walks in a room for a business deal, I'm creative, you're creative. It's us three: Racheal, Kari, and LeBron James. It's like a silent responsibility where LeBron James is thinking like, all right, whatever happened, I'm probably gonna have to put up all the money. And I'm using him as an exponential example.
Sure.
But that's what happens when you start flaunting money around any other thing. And then people kind of become careless with your money. It's like, well, you know, you got the Rolex, you got the Cadillac. I mean, you know, we lose money on this venture. Do you really care? And that can be a huge problem as you make more money. So you have to operate, in my mind, and that's the cool thing about me, because it's like people be like, oh, he probably ain't got 2 dimes to rub together. And it's like, that's a good thing, a granddad
keep
thing.
thinking that.
You know what I'm saying? A granddad thing. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not walking in with the onus and the responsibility of like, well, he'll pay for everything, so it doesn't make a difference whether we fail or succeed. It's almost like this is monopoly money. You know what I'm saying? Hell no, this ain't monopoly money. This is business money where we got to make it make sense on paper. And you're doing that with a lot of businesses.
Yeah. I would just say, I think why I'm so passionate about this is because I have walked the same walk that the entrepreneurs I'm working with have walked, meaning I'm not talking to you from a place of I've never done it. I'm talking to you from having $0 in the bank and scaling a business, being a single person doing the work to hiring a team of people. So I have to, the same automation, delegation strategies and systems that I teach people, I've had to live. And it's uncomfortable and difficult most of the time. So I'll use an example. You got a chance to stop by our business conference a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And that conference, the Run Your Business Like a Boss conference, was a vision I had for multiple years. But at least 3 years, I've had this vision of being able to produce a one-day conference and make it different than most other small business conferences. Most conferences will talk about if you got an idea, how to start, how to do this. They're talking to everybody. I really wanted to focus on how do we run businesses? What's the practical knowledge that we need to know when we're doing the day-to-day struggle? And one of the things that was a big pivot for me was being able to lean on a team. And that's been my whole focus for this year of 2022 is how to fire myself from the day-to-day of my own business. And I brought in some folks from my team to build the conference for me. And I was so out of the weeds that when I got there, I said, the color is blue? It's blue in here?
Hilarious.
I was like, so I was kind of upset. I said, I would have worn my blue blazer, not my gold. Our colors are blue and gold. I would have worn my blue blazer, not my gold blazer. And for a second, I said, I should talk to somebody about this. Because why didn't I? And I said, wait a minute, just stop. Just stop for a second.
Yep.
Look at the growth that you were able to have, that they took care of every single detail, down to the color of the room. And you didn't have to know about it because you were off raising money for the conference, getting people here, getting the support. And so I say that because when I talk about delegation, that was one of the examples I used that day of I've had to fire myself from giving a shit about what color the place is. What I'm caring about? Where the money coming from? So, and I say that because when I'm teaching entrepreneurs that not everybody is going to have a business that's scalable. Not everybody is going to hire an employee. For me, I want to create jobs for people. I want to create the kind of jobs that at a place I want to work, which means I need people to help me bring those visions together. So I say that because the same getting out of my comfort zone, the same, upper limit problems that other people have, I've had them too. So now I can speak from a place of humility and having to say, I know what it's like to have hired too fast and had to fire early, or hiring the wrong people and not getting the right value in production, or having to trust people who are smarter than me and pay a lot of money for that. Like, I know all of those things. And so I say that as an entrepreneur, that's where I get so passionate about saying none of us are doing this perfect. In fact, most of us don't even really know what we're doing.
Yep.
But if we can be transparent enough with other entrepreneurs, then we can take away some of the information that people are hearing on social media that's clouding their judgment, that's making them feel like they're doing it wrong when they don't have a lot of followers. I don't even use social media, and I probably will start doing more of it because my customers aren't finding me on social media. They're finding me through word of mouth and through how I'm able to help support other people that they know. So I say that because when we sometimes can look at followers and this and what somebody's doing, it makes us feel inferior.
Yes.
When that's not even real, So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to have these kinds of conversations with people because that's what really matters. What really matters is where's your heart in your business? What is it that you're doing that you give a shit about? Because when you're waking up every day from a place of pouring into other people and making an impact and helping, the resources come. And I don't want to say this to say that I don't think about money or resources, but that is not why I do it. And every single day I get connected with different people and different opportunities, and the resources for the businesses come, which is how I can do it. And, at such a complex level at this point in time.
I love it. And I mean, I've definitely referred you, to a couple of people at this point. You've done some work with them. You were big in the gig fair. We're going to talk about an iteration of that again soon. This has been a wonderful discussion. I also would add on everything you say, definitely stick to your passion and be committed. This stuff isn't overnight. If it's the propaganda or the media wing comes to me in marketing, it makes it seem as though business happens like that. And usually if a business happens like that, I look at it like it's people behind the scenes that have probably 30, 40, 50, 60 years of business, like propping up that 12-year-old.
Yeah.
And it's a good marketing play to be like, okay, the 12-year-old probably will sell better than the 90-year-old guy that's been in business for 70 years for what we want to sell. Also, the other thing I often want to, have started presenting is a lot of the businesses you see and you're going to hear about, if you're not really getting into circles and connecting with the actual businesses you can touch, they are on they're public companies. So like a company that's on the New York Stock Exchange is functioning in a different level than you and your business. Because if you're functioning and feeding basically investors, that's what a shareholder is, as opposed to like really feeding the person that's gonna like the end consumer. That's different. And I'm not saying that a company on the New York Stock Exchange doesn't care about the end user, but it's I would say it kind of takes it takes a back seat to my shareholders. So we need to do different things for our shareholders. So don't always think that you need to compete in that. And then the conference was wonderful. It was kind of like, walking in the cell phone store, you're always like, man, you got all this stuff for new customers, because that's how a lot of these business conferences are. It's for startups. It's for new. And it's like, you don't even really know what you're doing until I think you've been in business for about 7 years. But the person that's been in business for 7 years, where are the resources for them? And you sometimes feel out the loop, and you're, trying to like rig a network together of some people. You met this person and that person. I was on vacation. This person said they do what I do. And you actually gave some resources to the people operating the businesses and running the businesses at different points. And that's some game that is so essential. So I tip my hat. I was glad to be there. In effect, when I was in effect, and, you had some heavyweights in there. Shout out Nina Payne and so many other people putting that together. So classic Detroit is different questions as we get to a close. So very first car, year, make, and model, and year you got it.
Oh, gosh. Very first car would have been a 1991 Mercury Cougar.
Okay.
And I got it in 2001. So I guess it would have been about a 10-year-old car when I got it. Mm-hmm. And, oh, gosh, I remember buying it from one of those buy here, pay here places. Oh, so I put some money down with one of my refund checks, and I would have to make this car payment every month. So let's say I was paying about $200 a month. And they had one of those like mail far swipe passes underneath it.
Oh, man.
So if you didn't make your payment, your car wouldn't start.
Yeah.
And I would pay my payment every month, but there would still be times I would get out there and my car wouldn't start. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking there is going to come a point in time where I do not need to do this anymore. And I ended up paying the car off, and it was fine after that. But, yeah, that was my very first car. That was mine. I paid for it. And if I'm actually telling it wrong, that was the first real car that I had. But before that, I also had a 1991 Chevy Cavalier. I bought it, and in one day I paid $500 for it. And I bought it not realizing that the hood latch was broken. I got it on the freeway, and it smashed my windshield.
Whoa, that's got to be one of the scariest. Like, you felt like you was in a Fast and Furious movie.
Yeah, so I don't count that car as my first car because I never got to drive it anywhere.
I was like a Fast and the Furious situation.
But the Mercury Cougar was for real my first car.
Okay. You're the DJ at the end of the Detroit fireworks, Woodward and Jefferson. You get to play 3 songs. Ooh. What songs you playing?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say these are probably my top favorite songs in the world. What You Won't Do for Love by Bobby Caldwell. All I Do by Stevie Wonder.
Okay.
And I would say anything. Ooh, let's see. Now I'm going to say, I have so many different diverse favorites, but now I'm going to say anything off of Beyonce's Renaissance album.
Okay, because I was going to say, you're going to have them old folks in there ballrooming. You're going to have the people.
Throw something from Renaissance.
You're going to have some white linen and some top hats out there with that playlist. They're going to be like, oh, we love that DJ. All right, last one. You can rename Woodward after one Detroiter. Who would it be and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would say probably, I think Stevie Wonder just comes to mind for me. And it's going to definitely be somebody who I think has a rich musical history from Detroit. So for me, that could be anybody. That could be Aretha or Stevie Wonder. It could be any one of those folks. But probably somebody from Motown, I would probably say.
That's cool. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. We're definitely going to get you back in effect. We're going to do some more things. The gig fair concept is where we met, and I think that we're going to keep that seed and putting some water on it, see what comes together, because that was always big on me. It's like I go to these conferences, and I'm like, get these people some business. You know what I'm saying? Especially for the solopreneurs, people like me, and knowing where you are a solopreneur and when you can scale up, when you scale back, and how to function. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Peace.
Detroit is Different is where you get information, artistry, history, music, and even comedy. Detroit is Different, a home for the culture of Detroit. Visit online at DetroitisDifferent.com today.